Welcome everyone who's joined us here in person in the room and those of you who've joined us online. This is the panel with the title, Can Governments Save Independent Journalism? Should they? Will they? My name is Rasmus Nielsen. I'm director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford. I'm going to be chairing this panel with Meera Selva, who's the CEO of Internews Europe, and Jodie Ginsberg from the Committee to Protect Journalists. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to the two panelists. I'll say just a few things to frame the conversation here, and then ask Meera and Jodie to open up with some of their own experiences in the front lines of the fight for independent journalism around the world. Then we'll have a bit of a conversation here at the panel, and then open up for questions and comments and ideas and input for those of you who've joined us here in person. So I suppose if we wanted to keep this really short, we could say no, no, and yes. But if you want the sort of the long read version of it, the more in-depth version, I think we can probably fill out those bones a little bit more. When I say no, I mean I think there is a saying that's I think popular amongst activists in many parts of the world, that only the people can save the people, and I think that's something that journalists should keep in mind as well. That it's not a great position to be in if we expect the people that we aim to hold to account to be the ones to be the final guarantors of our ability to do so freely. Now, will they? My personal view is that we should not be naive about the intentions or commitments that powerful people will make. And my personal assessment is that the sort of range of views amongst politicians around the world towards journalism range from benign indifference over rank hypocrisy and towards outright hostility. So I think we sort of you make policy with the politicians you have, not the politicians that you want. And the tools that you might see a President Obama wield might also be wielded by the next president. And the tools that might be wielded by a President Macron might also be wielded by whoever might be the next president. So I think we need to be realistic about what the political environment is. Should they? I mean, in one sense, that's a personal question for each of us as citizens and for citizens around the world, that each of us can think about what do we think is the right principal role for government in enabling, supporting, protecting, furthering independent journalism. But if you want to be sort of more legalistic about it, you can also note that there are more than 170 signatories of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is a legally binding international treaty that commits those states to protecting the fundamental rights of citizens, including their right to receive and impart information from a range of different sources. So there is a clear legal basis on which we as citizens can expect governments and countries across the world to act to protect and enable independent journalism. Will they do it? Separate question. But many of them have signed up to do so. What can they do? This is where we want to get into the weeds of the people who are at the forefront of this. Many of you in the room are as well. Many of those of you who are following us online are in the trenches of these fights as well. I think sort of a simple way that I think about the role of government is to start with the observation that governments can do a lot. Governments can do things for good, to protect fundamental rights, including the rights of journalists and citizens who rely on journalism, to protect independent news media from media capture by oligarchs, by parts of the government itself, by forces in society that are antithetical to the idea of independent journalism. Governments can go above and beyond that and provide further support to enable the work of professional journalists. Of course, governments can also act for ill, as many of you know from personal experience, and I think we see across the world in a context of sort of democratic recession. It's a choice whether they do it. And it's a choice also when they do nothing, and we need to be clear-eyed about that and document that and report that and bring it to the public's attention. What can they do? I think they can protect freedom, that is the starting point. The context in which independent journalism can be exercised is one in which fundamental rights are protected, including the freedom to receive and impart information. In countries where, as citizens, we can reasonably expect that most governments will protect those freedoms, I think we can hope for more than that. I think we can think about the role of government for a sort of a second F, if you will, funding. That can take many different forms. We know that those forms can also be used as tools for media capture, whether that is through state advertising, selective rewarding of friends, punishing of enemies, statutory notices used in different ways. There are many ways in which these things can go wrong, but they can also go well, right? There are ways of supporting independent journalism, either directly or indirectly for nonprofits and private sector media, through the creation of genuine independent public service media governed at an arm's length principle. We see this in a few countries in the world. It can be done. There are ways of committing public resources to supporting independent journalism. So funding is sort of a second F. And if we want to go beyond the present, I mean, that would already be a big step. We can also think about the future. Right, there are a lot of panels, rightly so, at this festival about AI, for example, right? There's a whole set of regulatory and policy questions around how AI can be used and what conditions we can agree upon politically. This can also have implications for journalism. We can think about providing funding that isn't for sustaining existing news organizations and forms of journalism, but supporting innovation, training, upskilling of journalists, new generations, new kinds of journalism, underserved communities and the like. So freedom, funding, and the future are the sort of the three Fs I use to sort of think about the role of governments. We'll talk about some of the possible examples of this, but I want to turn now to our panelists to hear their experiences of working with this really truly in a global fashion in different ways at Internews and the Committee to Protect Journalists. So I'll turn to you first, Meera, to share with everyone here some of your experiences.
Thanks very much, Rasmus, and hi, everyone. I'm Meera Selva. I'm the CEO of Internews Europe, and for those of you who don't know, it's a media development organization that supports independent journalism globally in over 100 countries. And many of these countries are countries that are not particularly conducive to press freedom, put it mildly. So we have journalists working under incredibly difficult conditions. And so I'm looking at this topic, really from a global scale and say, what if we say all governments, what do we want from all governments? And, on a very basic line, you really want them to support independent journalism by not killing journalists, not jailing journalists, not putting them in physical danger. And the wider point of that is to make sure they're treated as citizens. So to treat them as citizens who are doing a professional job, and so that they have the legal protections, the social protections, the kind of financial framework to enable them to carry on doing their job, so that journalism isn't a series of heroic events, essentially. So, you don't have to make a personal choice every single time about reporting a story or putting your family in danger. It shouldn't be. So this is kind of a big pullback. What I'd really like to say that governments can support independent journalism just by doing that, by not treating journalists differently to other parts of society. And this, so that's kind of one major thing. And then I've just come from the Summit for Democracies, which is a big intergovernmental summit led by the United States, but also with Costa Rica, with the Netherlands, with Zambia and South Korea, co-hosting summits to talk about the various challenges the democracies around the world face. And we at Internews led the media freedom cohort. So what we try to do is bring together civil society, private sector, governments to make commitments to support journalism, because of this understanding that they can't do it alone. Governments are not going to be the single people who save journalism. It has to be a multi-stakeholder process, because journalists are meant to be troublemakers. They're meant to ask questions. They're meant to make life really difficult, even for the people who support them. And therefore, they can only really do that if they are supported from a multiplicity of sources. And out of that, we do have initiatives, and there is some willingness amongst governments to address this on a global level and on a national level. So there's the International Fund for Public Interest Media. There is the Media Viability Accelerator that's hosted by Internews. And these are kind of collaborative models that try to say one of the biggest challenges facing journalism is financial viability, and what can governments do to help support journalism find its own solutions. So can it provide a framework? Can it provide some kind of infrastructure? So that just goes somewhere. And then the third point I want to talk about is really about governments do support journalism in different ways. We are funded by several. We have several funders. Most of them are kind of governmental, or the European Union, or the kind of Swedish government overseas aid budget. We have foundation funding as well. But governments often fund journalism in other countries. So they fund independent journalism, but not in their own country, they fund it abroad. And they do this for several reasons. Sometimes to promote democratic values, to promote stability, because they think it's part of a response to the misinformation crisis, to address issues like vaccine hesitancy or kind of increasingly climate disasters. But ultimately, it's about kind of promoting your set of values abroad through the media. And that works when the values are to support independent journalism. So when you believe that what you're supporting is the right of news outlets in other countries to report on matters that matter to their community, and to have editorial freedom, and have a model where you kind of basically give support but really expect no input into the editorial output of the outlets you might be supporting, either directly or indirectly through organizations such as Internews. It's massively problematic when it turns the other way around, when things start, that money starts coming with a price, because you're not really supporting independent journalism, you're supporting journalism, or you're supporting strategic communications in certain countries. And this is just something that needs to be watched, and it's something several players are doing. Several countries are obviously doing this, and they have been doing this for centuries in many ways. It's not new at all. But when we do talk about why the media sector needs to be viable and receive a multiplicity of sources, a multiplicity of funding, I think this is fundamental, that they need to be able to say no to sources of funding that they are uncomfortable with, whether it's from their own governments or from other governments as well.
Thank you, Meera. I think we'll return to some of the themes, but Jodie, at the Committee to Protect Journalists, you are really at the sharp end of these acts of heroism that Meera is talking about, but tell us more about your experience of working to protect these fundamental rights as journalists have as citizens, but also that the rest of us rely on.
Okay, thanks, Rasmus. And I'm going to approach this actually because before I was at CPJ, I was doing Meera's job at Internews Europe, and so I have a perspective both from the media development and funding side, and then now at the Committee to Protect Journalists from the rights and freedom side. So in answer to your original question, I disagree actually that the answer is no. I think the answer is it's complicated. I think the answer is it's complicated because there is an ecosystem that needs to exist, of which governments are fundamentally part, either for good or for ill, in which we need them to be engaged if independent media is going to flourish. So if we take the kind of three buckets that you spoke about, Rasmus, if we think about freedom, I think we can think about the freedom from and freedom of. So I'm now living in the United States, where the First Amendment is wrapped around everyone like a great flag and is hugely celebrated. But if you think about the First Amendment, it really only protects the press from regulation of the press. It doesn't necessarily set out to protect the press. So it doesn't protect the press from the role of rich corporations or oligarchs, or the ability to have huge amounts of money to shift the discourse. So that alone, the idea that governments will not interfere, is not actually a sufficient protection for ordinary people so that they can ensure that they're receiving a plethora of views and an independent media. And we've seen that in many countries, right? You watch what's happening in Hungary and the kind of huge ownership concentration that we're seeing of the media. That requires us just not to think about non-government intervention, but who gets to control the media in order for a number of media organizations to flourish. So I think that's the first thing we need to think about, is what are the guarantees that government might put in place that a pluralistic independent media can exist and support. Then the second thing, if we think about funding, as Meera has said, governments think about funding in a number of ways. So it's interesting to me that many governments are quite happy to invest in media in other countries, but would shy away from it in their own countries. Well, we want to do independent media over there in country X, but we weren't prepared to do it here because that's government interference. And I think that's something that we need to really reflect on. If we're prepared to invest in media in any way other than a kind of colonial act, what is it? Why would we be prepared for governments to invest in media? And I think there are ways for governments to invest in, at least in independent entities that then go on to fund media and through other mechanisms. So taxation is a very common mechanism in many places that provides some kind of buffer between government and an independent media, but is essential to fund independent public interest media. And I know we'll come and talk about the fraught question of what's public interest media in a second. But there are other things we can do. So we can think about, for example, tax breaks on organisations. So in the UK, for example, journalism is not considered a charitable act, or hasn't in the past been considered a charitable act. So you can't set up a charity easily that produces public interest news, and you can't set that up as a charity and receive the breaks that you would be afforded if you were a charity working on environmental issues, say. Those are kinds of things that we can think about that could have some kind of government influence to create an independent media. And then the final thing is when we think about future, is thinking about what, and I know lots of conversations have been had here about what are the different models. Are there mechanisms by which government can create either a regulatory space, a permissive regulatory space that allows these other models to flourish? So those are the areas where I think it's really important that before we say government should have no involvement, I think taking a step back and see how government can create an enabling environment is the way to think about the means by which we would permit government to be involved in independent media.
We all have our roles to play, and you know how it is when there is a panel with a university professor and journalists and advocacy organizations, that the role of the professor is to simplify and exaggerate, and that the role of the journalists and advocacy organizations is to say, isn't it more complicated than that? I wonder, I really want to very much amplify what Jodie said at the beginning of your remarks, that one of the wonderful things about being in Perugia, in addition to Perugia being wonderful, is that we can have these conversations without letting the parochial and peculiar fundamental rights discussion of a single country representing 4.25% of the world's population take our imagination hostage, and that we can think about freedom of expression both as a negative right, protection from state interference and government censorship and the like, but also a positive right. And of course, as you alluded to in the United States during the Reagan administration, the first one, the negative right, was part of the quote-unquote justification for abolishing some of the rules that in turn led to some very interesting legal developments in recent days. I wonder whether I can ask each of you to offer any experiences you have. Like, if you sit down with powerful politicians in countries where we may say the media freedom situation is mixed, above and beyond any appeals you make to principles, what kind of more sort of pragmatic arguments might you make to them to try to persuade them that they may have a self-interest in protecting independent journalism?
I think in countries, Singapore, Rwanda, the two that come to mind, these are countries which have very restrictive media, but relatively high-functioning governments that, provide kind of a high range of services to their citizens. So most citizens are happy with the pact. They're happy with the restricted media presence in exchange for, relative freedom in most lives. So in those kind of conversations, the appeals you make really are about the young. The fact that the kind of younger population are not buying this pact, they're not agreeing with you. They might not yet be protesting, but that's just because they're getting the news elsewhere from abroad via digital outlets and VPNs, and they're just not engaging with you yet. And when they do decide to engage with you, you have no idea what they're going to say or do because you've not been giving them the information. So I think that's been one of the most effective ways of saying this is why you need to have independent journalism in your own country, because you're going to lose. People are still going to get their information, they're just going to get it from elsewhere, and you won't see it at all.
Jodie?
I think I would actually make the appeal more local. I'm increasingly concerned about the impact that the decline in the media sector, the carving out of local journalism is having obviously on the safety of journalists. And I think, there's been some really powerful studies looking at the impact of so-called news deserts on communities. And places that have a more pluralistic local media have more money coming in taxes, for example. So you can appeal directly to people's pockets. Investment is very clearly linked, and tax revenues are clearly linked to having a more pluralistic, independent media. And I think you can extrapolate that argument out. Investors also are interested in places where they can invest in a more varied sector. If you suffocate your media entirely, you're reducing the number of people who are able to invest and then again bring revenue back to the government. So I think we can do a better job of tying these things back to the things that people care about, like how much revenue is coming in.
So if we turn from the discussions around freedom to the discussions around funding, I suppose there are a couple of different things we can take a bite at. One is, what are some of the tools that are available through which governments can, if the citizenry supports this idea, indirectly or directly support independent journalism? But there are also sort of questions about, well, who should be at the receiving end? There is this sort of notion of public interest journalism, for example, and we can think about the issue that Meera in particular highlighted about, where should this money flow to? Not just what types of organizations, but also what geographies. Is this quote-unquote overseas aid, or is it something that we think of also or primarily as a domestic issue? Jodie, we discussed this when we were planning the panel, but do you want to take a stab first at the question of how we think about who might be at the receiving end of the funding?
Yeah, so this is really interesting to me. I've watched the discourse on journalism and media and how we support media and what media is for and journalism is for shift over a number of years. And recently, there's been a lot of interest in the notion of public interest media or public interest journalism as a way of trying to sort of work out what might be the kinds of media that governments, but indeed other entities, are prepared to fund. And in my view, and I know that their views differ on this, but in my view, I think that's problematic. Again, it's oversimplifying. Certainly the idea that we might have governments decide on their own entirely what's in the public interest is deeply problematic, not least because inevitably, and Meera will know this much better than me from the work of Internews, that excludes populations, excludes in particular minority, historically disadvantaged communities who tend to not be on the receiving end of that kind of investment. So I think we need to be extraordinarily careful not to cohere around this notion that we can identify sort of a single source of truth about what constitutes public interest and then drive all of the money there. Not least because whenever we do this kind of thing, authoritarian regimes follow suit. So, they'll take a law that's meant, or a methodology that is meant to help people to justify their own aims. We've seen it with national security legislation, and I can certainly see it coming with public interest media. Well, we know what's in the public interest, and that is our narrative, and that's, we're just doing what you guys are doing. So I think we need to be very, very cautious about adopting this idea that there is a kind of single way of understanding what is public interest, because the net result, I fear, is that money will continue to flow to majority interest media and fail to get to the places that have been historically not served by investment.
Just for context, I think it's worth keeping in mind here that there are some academic studies, for example, by Rodney Benson from NYU in the United States, suggesting that nonprofit funding for media tend to flow to media that serve even more privileged audiences than subscription-based media, which is, I think, sort of quite important to think about. How does one think about the incentive structure and what is actually being rewarded? Sometimes it's talked about as adopting the model that's used by arts councils and the like to support independent artists. But I think we need to sort of think through to its conclusion what do Arts Council actually support? And is it sort of art for people like me, or would that be the same that we want for journalism, or what is it exactly? Meera, I mean, you have a lot of experience of thinking through this space of both, how one channels the money, but also who might be at the receiving end. What do you think of this issue of public interest media, or more broadly, who should be at the receiving end?
Well, this is the issue of really about diversity, and it's about who is making the decisions over where the money goes, and then how much do they understand. They might decide that money needs to go to a certain minority community, but without a real understanding of how that minority community works, the way the project will be framed, the kind of the metrics for success, the kind of output the outlets are allowed to produce won't really match what their community needs. So you really need people who understand a community at every step of the way, making decisions over how the money flows. So, the people giving the grants need to be from the community, and then the people receiving the grants need to be from that community, really. Because public interest media, it's not just about output, it's not just about producing a certain amount of news, it's then got to be consumed. It's got to be, and it's usually done because you want to do something. You want to have people increase their civic participation, or because you want them to get over vaccine hesitancy. I'm just giving an example off my head, or respond in certain ways to a kind of to an emergency, a disaster, and so people will only do that if they trust the information, and that's both the way it's framed, the way it's written, but then also how it's funded. And so this is it's not as simple as saying we'll just give money to we've identified that there is an underprivileged community or an underserved community, and we will give money, and that addresses the issues Jodie's very correctly raised, because it's still are not going to produce a particularly viable product at the end of it.
So I think there are some very important signals here being sent to those who are working in this space, and I want to be very clear that I personally consider the International Fund for Public Interest Media to be one of the most innovative and promising and interesting new policy ideas in this space, and I'm very glad to see all the work that's being done and the support that's beginning to trickle in. But the fact that I think it's very innovative and inspiring and very important does not make the issues go away that Jodie have identified. I mean, it is a real question of how one can govern a structure like that in a way that doesn't end up simply giving more money to already well-supported organizations, but really, works in the spirit of what Meera describes as the media for us and by us, that aren't simply super serving already well-served audiences or further supporting already very well-supported organizations.
And this is something just I'm really seeing in the not-for-profit sectors that we're looking at. You do end up with donor darlings, media outlets in certain countries that really know how to fill in the forms and know how to kind of speak to donors, and they are often excellent. They produce really, really good work. So it's quite hard to say, even though they're excellent, even though they've got a good track record, even though we know they'll deliver, we're still going to possibly look elsewhere for outlets to support. It's really, it's a resource-poor space, and it's not easy. And again, this is about how do you foster innovation in these places, in certain countries and in certain areas, because you want to support new outlets, but you also want to kind of support them at scale, and it's not as simple as saying, we provide seed funding and then leave, because the funding often needs to be long-term and sustained over a long time. But how do you provide that long-term sustainable funding and then still continue to support more and more new players in the market?
And I would just add to that, I think, it doesn't just need to be long-term and sustainable, it also needs to be flexible. I mean, what we saw in Afghanistan after 30 years of, frankly, government investment or foreign government investment in Afghanistan was a system that was not fit for purpose, that was not able to continue to support independent media, and recognize that now it needed to be supported in exile, or now it needed to be supported in a much more nuanced way, because the model was, this is how we do independent media, and with absolutely no flexibility for what happened when the situation changed dramatically. And I think we see that time and time again, that you go down a path where there is one way of doing it. It is seen to be one way of doing things in order to sustain an independent media sector that needs to be able to adjust for very rapidly changing circumstances.
I've worked briefly in foreign development in a previous life myself, and I think sometimes that it's fair to say there is a risk that government support is better designed to look like it's supporting something than to actually support something. And perhaps we've seen that sometimes also in media development. I want to just sort of bring out one dimension of the sort of argument for letting 1,000 flowers bloom and thinking about the role of public support as part of that. Which is one I think we need to be explicit about, which is that when we talk in terms of abstractions, public interest journalism, maybe even independent journalism, these are very positive words. No one in this room sits in this panel because you think that public interest journalism is a bad thing or independent journalism is a bad thing. But we may not always, all of us, agree, even in this room and certainly outside this room, what exactly that means. And I think we need to just be explicit that if we look at some of the examples of media policies that exist in the world and that are often regarded by many as examples of good practice, to take just a single example, if Rupert Murdoch and News Corp operated newspapers in my native Denmark, they would get money from taxpayers to do that journalism. And that is not by accident, that is by design. That is because the indirect and direct forms of subsidy that are available for private sector news publishers are meant to be strictly content neutral. They do not pass judgment on the editorial in any way. They do not give any politician or bureaucrat or committee of the great and the good the right to pass judgment on what constitutes journalism that merits that support. It is general support. And I just think we need to be quite clear about that is sort of part of, that is a feature, not a bug of some of these forms of support that, maybe some of you think that's great, that sounds great. Murdoch should receive tax money. Look, he's got legal bills and whatnot. But it's just, I think, important to be clear that is part of what it means to embrace the ideas that are quite general. There are others that are hyper-specific. Ideas. I know that the good folks at the Daily Maverick in South Africa have proposed the idea of essentially embracing the idea already used to reward whistleblowers in some jurisdictions of channeling parts of reclaimed assets from documenting cases of fraud to the people who have exposed the fraud, to expand that model to support investigative journalism. So I think there are some very concrete examples that reward very specific kinds of journalism, very specific organizations. But the other kinds of general support, we need to be clear that they will support lots of different kinds of journalism, and that is by design. And we may not always all like all of those kinds of journalism. One last thing, and just to hear your views on this maybe, and then I think we should open it up. So if people have questions, you can sort of start formulating the questions. There'll be roving mics. I wonder how the two of you think about the sort of the size of the commitments that governments are currently making. Again, I'm an academic. I like to simplify and exaggerate. So I've invented my own currency for how I think about the commitments that governments make. This currency is the F-35 fifth-generation fighter jet. The unit cost allegedly is something like $100 million, right? So when the Biden administration commits up to $30 million US to the International Fund for Public Interest Media, in my head, I see the tip and the left wing and part of the tail of a single F-35 fighter jet. That's the commitment. Okay, that's not nothing. And then when the French government commits up to 15 million euros, maybe we can get the right wing as well. We're quite far from a functioning plane, but it's not nothing. How do you think about the size of these commitments? I mean, these are very large governments. What do you think of a commitment of that size, or other commitments you can think of? It doesn't need to be that precise or that specific.
Well, I'm not that much of a nerd, so I can't think in terms of fighter jets, sorry, but the kind of commitment, sorry, it made me laugh. The commitments that, the kind of generally accepted commitment that we're asking for is 1% of the overseas development budget to go towards supporting independent journalism. No country, as far as I know, is managing that at all, nowhere near close. And the percentage is partly to address the issue that governments have different budgets. What we're seeing instead, which is not particularly helpful, is the entire overseas development budget is being cut in many places. And then also when governments do say they are willing to keep part of that shrinking budget for media, what they're really looking at is media, either Ukraine, which is good, but then also media which is really telling people in other countries not to think of getting on a boat and coming over. So it's kind of strategic comms aimed at deterring refugees, which is not support to media at all, but it's often smooshed into the same bucket. And I think this is hugely problematic, and this is a kind of conversation that really we have with governments, and we continue, and I think everyone needs to have these conversations with governments, that support for independent media has to be support for independent media. It can't be combined with budgets that are essentially for communications, propaganda, policy aims, because it'll immediately lose all credibility. And then it just becomes a complete waste of money, and also far more dangerously, it harms the journalists on the ground who receive that money, who then lose trust and credibility and often put in danger in their own community. So it's something that absolutely mustn't happen.
I think it's woeful. I think it's absolutely woeful when you think about the size of just the American defense budget alone. It's woeful. And that's true, obviously, not just of what's being spent on independent media, but a variety of other things that are essential for societies to thrive. But part of this, I think, is also about how we value journalism. And I think we've all struggled as journalists in recent years that people have not ascribed a value, a financial value. We went through the whole of the 90s giving away content for free, and sort of suddenly woke up and realized that we've been giving it away for free, and suggesting that content was, magically produced somehow out of thin air that didn't require people who'd been trained, resources. And so we are now having to do a sort of double struggle, which is governments are pulling back on these budgets, but also we are tackling this challenge that for many years, people have seen that as not having an intrinsic value and something that can be paid for. So we are all in the process in various different ways of trying to work out how we re-engage with readers and governments and investors to say this content that we're producing has worth. And I think that's why you're seeing all of these different models. I completely agree with you that the Thousand Flowers is absolutely vital. While we're seeing a lot of different models, there isn't a particular, one answer. Some communities are having really excellent membership models because they've been able to show the value that their content brings to that specific community. And I think continuing to talk about why it matters, why it's important. And we at the Committee to Protect Journalists increasingly talking about not just, what happens, it's wrong to kill anybody, it's wrong to kill a journalist, but what is the story that is lost? Why did the story that person was reporting on matter? Why does it matter to the community if that voice is lost? And I think continuing to do that and show people that what we do has value and it matters, not to burnish the reputations of journalists, but for all of us, I think is really key.
So let's judge governments and politicians on what they do and not what they say they do. And let's remember not just the new gifts they give, but also that, again, the context is one in which we see cuts to public service media, freezes to license fees, attempts to dismantle the existing forms of direct and indirect support that exist in many places. That's also part of where we are right now. Right, we'll open up for questions now. If the questions are about F-35s, then we'll take them later outside. If they're about the role of government and media freedom, we'll take them here. If you have a question, please raise your hand. If you feel comfortable doing so, please identify yourself. If you don't, that's fine as well. I can't see everybody, but I'll do what I can to try to make sure we get a diverse range of different people asking questions. So please don't be personally offended if I don't ask people in the order in which they raise their hands. I think we have a question at the back over here.
Hi, I'm Augustin from Les Jours, a French independent media, and I'm also part of the French Trade Association of Independent Medias. And I wanted to ask you about your definition of independence, because we've found at the Trade Association that it's pretty tricky to define independence. Is it editorial independence, shareholding independence? And I wanted also to say to Rasmus that I very much agree with your point about public funding going to billionaires, which is pretty much massively the case in France. So thanks.
Thank you. Does any of you want to take a bite at the independent definition?
On a basic level, it's that nobody except the news editor has input into the editorial control of a newspaper. That's kind of fundamental level. So that can be, through explicit issues, but also kind of implicit self-censorship issues. So, a situation where journalists don't report on something because they fear that it might annoy a key stakeholder would also be a way of kind of undermining editorial independence. So that would be my baseline journalistic definition of that.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, and I would say that I think in this discourse, independent is doing a whole lot of heavy lifting, which is why I think it's really important that we start to sort of, add in things like pluralistic, because realistically, it's really challenging, and in fact, I don't think anyone wants just, a kind of completely necessarily balanced point of view. And there's lots of interesting discussions now about, whether even we should be having a balanced perspective. So even balance, I think, ceases to be a useful definition. So I think having a pluralistic media actually becomes the more important thing. You could argue that there are lots of places where there are many independent media outlets, but they're all kind of saying the same thing. So having at least a pluralistic, I think, is a good way of looking at it.
I'm relieved you didn't ask us to define journalism or news, but I'll just offer two further comments on it. One is to say that partly it's a legal issue, right? And in Denmark, for example, part of the qualifying criteria for organizations that can receive direct and indirect subsidies is that they cannot be owned by an interest organization or a labor union. And of course, that historically has disqualified some organizations that did journalism, but were also instruments in a legitimate struggle over political power in society. In Italy, as far as I understand, this would also disqualify, I think, some news organizations. But of course, that then asks the second question, which is right now in a lot of parts of the world, we fundamentally can't know who owns media organizations, which is why that some of the discussions happening in Brussels over the European Media Freedom Act, for example, around transparency of ownership, I think, are sort of a precondition for getting to a good place around this. If there are any, yes, please, thank you. We have a question over here. I'm sorry, Peter, but I'll stick to my words on this.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? I'm Victoria Vilk. I'm the director for digital safety and free expression at PEN America. You were talking about how you asked about mechanisms, right, for public funding, and you were talking about the International Fund for Public Interest Media, which is essentially an independent pool, right, that's amassing from governments in other sectors, right, funding to distribute, kind of grant, I think in a grant-making model. There's also all these kind of bargaining code conversations happening right now where you have tech companies and media organizations directly negotiating transfer of funds. I think I'm really curious in a different model which the Free Press has advocated for, which is taxing ad revenue, right, from massive tech companies and putting that in an independent fund so that it's a mix of sort of individual taxpayer money but also corporate tax money. And so I guess I'm just curious to hear what you all think about it and what other people here might think about it.
Any?
I mean, so it comes back to the point I was making earlier, really, which is who then runs the fund and who gets the money out of it. I mean, we've looked at, there have been attempts to do this in a number of countries, and I think part of the challenge has been that in many of these instances, the result has been to continue to favor big media organizations and not small local media outlets because they, don't meet the qualification for being kite marked as a, independent outlet. And that, to me, is where, whether you tax corporations or not, and Rasmus has already talked about those examples, I think is kind of, I think that's a model that you can look at, but what is key is who then gets to decide where that money goes and who is able to receive the money.
I agree with that, and I think that the tech companies' global presence is already a bit skewed. So if you look at Meta, most of its users are in Asia, but most of its revenue is not. So it's already a bit of a skewed system. So if you create this pool, you'd have to think very carefully about, if advertising revenue is generated in a certain part of the world, where does the money where would the money then go to? Would it be diverted to the parts of the world where the platforms are used most, or would it stay where it's generated? So it's not a bad idea, but it just requires a lot of things, and you don't want unintended consequences, which you always seem to get with tech regulation.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add to it that I think every dynamic in the media market right now is a winner-takes-most dynamic. So if you think about the design of good public policy, pursuing public policies that reinforce those winner-takes-most dynamics and further entrenches incumbents, both on the content side and the platform side, I think it's worth discussing whether that's a good idea. I'll say two more things, one of which is that my personal view is tax the fuck out of them and then distribute the money in a transparent way on the basis of clear principles to recipients that are the intended recipients. That's my personal view. But the second one I'll say as a former civil servant is that hypothecated taxes are a very bad way of funding public services, because then when there is a recession in the advertising market, then there is less money for the public service. And surely we don't only need good journalism when tech companies make a lot of money. Some of those tech companies are in trouble right now. I'll take the two last questions, I think, in a row, because I know Jodie has a tight schedule and another important. So I'll take, I think Peter has been very patient at the back, and then there is another question over here. Apologies for not fitting in more.
Thanks, Rasmus. This is actually more of an anecdote than a question, but it may raise questions. I was involved in New Zealand in setting up a $75 million public interest journalism fund, which has lasted 3 years and was intended to support journalism that might otherwise have been lost during the COVID period. It did, in fact, go to an extraordinarily diverse group of people through an existing institution of great credibility, an allocation group. A lot of it went to Maori journalism and Maori organisations. However, it had a gigantic backfire. It was weaponised by the right wing, particularly during the COVID pandemic, to claim that media had been bought by the government. My own brother accused me of being part of the bought Jacinda Ardern media, which I wasn't, of course, and I haven't barely spoken to him since then. But there can be a backfire to that, and our colleague Maria Mialati for the JMAD report, the journalism report on trust, attributes part of a 10-point fall in trust in media over the last year to this idea that the government has bought media, even though this program was extremely well managed and has now also ended as well. So this can have some risks even in the best and most sensibly run countries like Denmark and New Zealand.
Thanks, Peter. I mean, I think this, once is connected to the previous question. So in a context in which many people feel that big media are in the pocket of government and technology companies, I think it's worth wondering about whether political agreements to secure more support from technology companies mediated by politicians is necessarily going to have a salutary effect on confidence. But please, a last question from over here, and then I think Jodie needs to go quite soon.
Thank you. My name's Sharish. I'm a freelance journalist, but my interest is I'm involved in various government working groups on the future of media. I wanted to pick up on the question quickly that Jodie started around defining public interest media, and that Rasmus took on with the Rupert Murdoch's legal bills paid by Denmark question. And I wonder if we flip it, and I think I know the answer to this is that it's very complicated, but actually lots of media get public money through indirect or direct subsidies and are harming people in communities. And it goes to the Reuters Institute's report earlier this week. Is there a way of defining public interest media so that those news organisations do not get public money? They can do what they want, but they're in a way kind of ruled out of getting that public money because they're harming people in communities as part of their business model.
I think the answer to that is yes. I think the mechanism for doing it will depend on the country in question. So, there is a very successful in many countries model of self-regulation that I think would enable the self-regulatory body or the regulatory body to define closely what is meant by harm and have burdens of proof around that would then potentially link to the subsidies that people get. That's a very simplified way of looking at it. But, again, speaking with my free expression hat on, you again have to be extraordinarily careful about how you define harm. And with my free expression hat on, I've in the past talked at great length about my concerns around hate speech laws because often they're drafted in such a way that doesn't end up benefiting the people who they're meant to help. And so I think the same would be true of these questions of harm, which we've also seen in the Online Harms Bill, which is now called something else in the UK. So I think there is a way, but I think you have to be extraordinarily careful about how you craft the language in order to make sure that you are providing protection as opposed to creating more situations in which people can be harmed.
Yeah, I mean, as you were speaking, I was trying to think of a single country or even a kind of town anywhere in the world that I would trust to implement something like this, and I can't think of a single one. I might be wrong, but I just can't see how you would have that mechanism, because the potential for abuse is too big.
But I mean, I think there is a way to turn your comment into an invitation for accountability, right, and reflection in the profession at large, right? So there's been a lot of panels at this conference, rightly so, about the impact of journalism, and one side of that is that there are things we aspire to as a society and that we believe journalism contributes to, but as has been pointed out rightly and importantly, sometimes journalism has a negative impact on communities, sometimes in society as a whole, sometimes on specific communities. And I think we need to reckon with that as a profession, as an industry, and have a public accounting over that. I personally share Meera's reservations about making it a tool of public policy, because again, we live in irreducibly diverse societies where people disagree often vigorously and very deeply on many, many issues. And I think if we assume or aspire to too much consensus, it'll necessarily become exclusive. And we have to think about the realpolitik of what that would look like, right? So just a single UK example, I mean, I would put to you that probably the majority of the British press felt that The Guardian did grave harm to national security and the public interest when they published the Snowden revelations. And if that had been a matter of public policy that you could only sort of operate and get support if you, pursued the public interest, then, you could see how that discussion could have taken some pretty ugly turns quite quickly. So I think we can have the discussion and should have the discussion that you highlight, but whether it's a public policy, I think is harder.
Really
Jodie needs to go.
I've got to run to the Profani.
Yeah.
I'm really sorry.
Thank you so much, Jodie. Thank you, everyone. And if you want to discuss F-35, I'm outside.